Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Arnold Weinstein, who is a professor emeritus of comparative literature at Brown University and also the author of a number of books. This latest book, it's called The Lives of Literature, Reading, Teaching, and Knowing. And I think in some ways, this is, I don't know, the most memoir-like of all of your books. There's a bit of a going back and reflecting on your life as a teacher in here. But of course, you've got tons of other books, and I think all of them have a little bit of biography in them, including this one called A Scream Goes Through the House, What Literature Teaches Us About Life, Morning, Noon, and Night, Finding the Meaning of Life's Stages Through Books, and then a couple others like The Fictions of the Self and The Fiction of Relationships, a book on Scandinavian literature. And I think a lot of these books are based on courses that you've taught. And, you know, when I look at some of the names of these courses, right, one's on medicine and one's on religion. And I think there was, what was another one? One on order and chaos in literature. It makes me want to take all these courses. Wow. And people can get a chance to take some of them because some of them you put onto Coursera and some of them you put onto this platform called The Great Courses. Used to be the teaching company. And so, there's a lot that we can talk about. But I guess maybe where I thought I'd start off is you make the claim that literature offers us knowledge that can't be obtained in any other way, right? And I think more broadly, I guess you would say art, because your discussions aren't simply limited to literature. I mean, or I guess it's literature defined broadly because you write about not just novels and poetry and theater, but also, you know, philosophy and essays and film and theater and so forth. So, I mean, what exactly is it that we can only get through literature? And what would it mean for people to go through life without exposure to literature?
Well, broad question, big one, but probably lots of answers. I'll give you a few. I think literature in this culture, and probably in most cultures, at least modern cultures, is devalued as a kind of fine arts hobby. Can't go to sleep, read a novel. And I think that they're completely missing the boat. The literature is a privileged and even unique form of discovery, including self-discovery. First of all, reading itself is a two-way street. You open a book, from the 5th century BC, and all of a sudden Sophocles is talking to you. He's not actually speaking, but that material, those words, so all reading is contemporary, even if you're reading historical, far away and long ago kinds of materials. It's also the case that there's a marvelous quote that I've always enjoyed that Harold Bloom said, "We know more about Hamlet than we know about our best friends." And I'm going to stay with Shakespeare for a minute, that I gave lectures years ago with the Shakespeare Society in New York. And one of the people I worked with said that she was frequently asked the question, "How much do you know about Shakespeare?" And her answer was, "Not as much as he knows about me."
Right.
And so it's, in that sense, it's a kind of, it's not self-help, it's self-discovery. It's about other selves, and it's not like we're going to all of a sudden, like Kafka, we're going to turn into Hamlet or something, or a big bug. But it's nonetheless a unique form of entry into other subjectivity. That's a kind of abstract way of putting it. Well, we can't do it in our own lives. I mean, I feel like I know my wife. I've been married more than 60 years. I can't get myself in her head, nor can she in mine. And we go through life like that. We are, as it were, siloed, to use one of your terms. Whereas literature, it's fiction, of course, but it's fiction that we, in a sense, explore and even experience. If you look at a person reading a book with your camera or your phone or whatever, not anything is happening. The eye may be blinking a little bit, but if you think about what's happening inside, it's like science fiction. It's space travel and time travel. That's all getting into you, and you're getting it. That's why I call it a two-way street. And so in that sense, I think it's a kind of invaluable resource. It's an expansion of what we are and who we are. It's obviously it would be good to know something about the historical moment in which these books were written. I think that's overdone because it misses what is so sort of alive and electric about the books when we read them. And I know that the word universalist, is in much this respect today. But I think that reading books is a way of sort of not just expanding our horizons, but really entering worlds as well as subjectivities that are not our own. And, I think it differs a lot from, let's say, seeing a film, because the film is the visual sense of things, but the filmmaker cannot deliver the words that are on the page. Now, the writer can't deliver what it looks like, but what it looks like is fixed. You look at that face on the screen, and that's what you see. You read the words on the page, and you begin to realize they mean 2, 3, 4, and 5 different things, and they all resonate differently with you. So there's a kind of openness, a kind of multi-dimension to the written text that I'm not sure is there in the painting or the film. I love painting and film, and I like to interpret them in the courses or in the books that I do. Nonetheless, I think reading, because there's nothing visual in it, when I teach, for example, Kafka's The Metamorphosis, my students are always dismayed and outright angry that Gregor Samsa's family has no great understanding for him. And what I try to get across to them is that they see him. We don't. And which is strange, because Kafka was a great draftsman. He decided not to put any illustrations, including his own, into that book. They see him. But we read Gregor. We know that because we can't see him as a bug, we know his heart and mind. We know his yearning to be reconnected with his family, that the old goals that he had to send his daughter, or his sister rather, to the conservatory, we know that. He can't communicate that to them. He cannot communicate that to them. So these are all the ways in which literature makes the unsayable, or at least unhearable, available to us.
Well, so there's a lot in there, and I'm wondering if you can elaborate on some of the connections, because you talk about how literature helps you to understand the other, right? Other times, other places, other people, but it also helps you to understand the self, right? I mean, are those necessarily connected? I mean, is it that the self is another, right?
Well,
you need to kind of, understand the other to understand the self?
Well, I have a peculiar vantage point on that because I'm an identical twin. And therefore, the first 17 or 18 years of my life while I was living in Memphis and going to high school there, only our best friends could tell us apart. So I was one of the Weinstein twins. And that doesn't happen to people who aren't twins. That in general, people see your face, they know your name, and there's no ambiguity or multiplicity in it. But that wasn't the case for me. And the reason I mention it is that only in this last book, this more reflective book even than the others, have I realized that experience, which was not like, once a month, it was all the time for all these years, that experience also shaped my understanding of art and literature as forms of getting into other consciousnesses, getting into other minds and hearts, so that it has a uniqueness in that regard. Writing does, as I said, because we enter the text that we are working with, and they enter us. I guess the self always is also another. And that's why I'm always drawn to metamorphosis in my books. And again, Kafka, we think of metamorphosis, as bees and plants and this, that, and the other, but we don't think that our own skin is ever going to become altered. We're not going to become a bug, except that in these books it shows that is happening, and then we see the price tag of it, and the pathos of it, and the richness of it. And then if we start thinking about it, we realize, what does genocide really depend on? It depends on thinking that others are not human. And all of history is marked by that, we only grant sort of human status to a few people. And in this country, we know our own history with regard to race, but also today to immigration, is stamped by the same kind of either blindness or deafness. It's difficult to become recognized for many people as a human being. So in that sense, again, it's a good workout to read literature. It expands things. I'm going to use a moral term. It makes us more generous as being able to award the notion of humanity, of real, to other people, because I don't think you can kill them. You can't stamp them out if you don't think that. I think back, of course, to what happened, to the Jews, genocide as well, that those moments, which, as I said, recur, hinge on our inability to imagine others as real.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you quote Kierkegaard. I mean, he's one of the, I think, people you like the most, right? And he said something like, life is lived forward, but understood backward. I mean, he probably should have said understood if it is understood. It's understood backward. But I mean, I think you're saying that literature kind of offers you a shortcut in a way. I mean, a way where you don't have to wait until the end of your life to understand it. You can gain some understanding of it by inhabiting these different perspectives in literature.
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that you put it. No, in the sense that anyone who has, if you read Hamlet at the age of 16, 20, 40, 60, and 80, it'll be a different play. I find that King Lear is moving to me, but I can't teach it to undergraduates. They just can't get there. But further, I find that my own understanding of great works of art evolves over time. So that even literature, in other words, it changes over time. And by the way, it has a lot to do with culture and society. People did, there are a lot of, when I was growing up in Tennessee and going to Princeton many, many years ago in the late 50s, early 60s, William Faulkner was thought to be a universal writer, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1949 for that. But on the other hand, I have found in teaching Faulkner that at a certain point, my students won't read him. And I have found in quoting Faulkner, or in, for that matter, teaching Huckleberry Finn and quoting that, I will get angry letters from my students saying, Professor Weinstein, you cannot use the N-word. And I answer, I'm not using it, I'm quoting it. And they say, you can't do that either. So that none of this is a quick fix. Reading these texts and reading them as generously as you know how is, if you believe that they are not just sort of cultural decoration, but that they could be existential, then that's an opening of sorts. But as I say, time still works its will on them. I can't help but believe that Kierkegaard did have it right, that we understand it backwards. And the reason that makes sense to me is that so many things happen to us and we only understand later what they were. And in other words, what they meant, that we have absolutely life-altering experiences that we frequently don't recognize as such. It's only in retrospect that we can read them and understand them. And I don't think that ever stops. I actually use the sort of hackneyed phrase, in my books, we're never through discovering who we are. That's both good and bad. I mean, the bad thing is obvious that we're pretty, stupid and ill-informed. But the good thing is that there are still discoveries that are conceivable and maybe even inevitable about who we are. I know that I'm a different person today than I was 10 years ago, or 20 or 30 or 40. And I don't think that college students have much sense of that yet. But if you ask them, how did you, change from what you remember of yourself, as a teenager or earlier still? And usually that's when it begins, the clock begins to tick a little and they realize, hold on, it's true.
But I mean, I think you're making a bigger point, right? Because, we've been talking about how literature helps you to understand life, right? And that literature kind of reflects life, or art reflects life. But I think you're also claiming that life kind of reflects art, right? And that literature isn't just simply a tool for understanding, but it actually shapes who you are. It teaches you how to live. It teaches you how to think. It teaches you how to feel. And so, when I think about, for instance, King Lear, I mean, you're right. I mean, when I saw King Lear when I was a young person, it was very different from how I experienced it later. But I do think that my experiencing of it later was influenced by my earlier exposure to it. Like there was a seed planted when I saw it as a young person, which made me start thinking. And so by the time I saw it again 10 years later, I was already, the wheels had already been put in motion because I had been exposed to it at that young age.
I won't disagree with that. I mean, I think you're right, Greg, however, think about this. How many people, one thing I enjoy saying to my students is, if you reread any book, it's going to look different. And then I realized the idiocy of saying that. They don't reread books. Professors do, intellectuals do. So a book that gets a second reading is a different book because we realize we now see things that we couldn't possibly have been equipped to see earlier. And things that we thought were crucial in them, we may have a different, maybe even a negative opinion of. And I think, as I say, it's connected as well to the world we live in. It's connected to cultural views and to the way things change. I can still remember easily when Columbus was thought to be a universal hero of sorts. And now, of course, statues of Columbus have been taken down in some places because he represents colonialism. These are ways in which vision itself changes. Things that were meaningful at one point don't stop being meaningful, but they're altered. Or in some cases, we worry about what they actually signified. And as a teacher, it's a complicated issue because, as I said, they're books you can't teach. I think it's tragic that I can't teach Faulkner. I mean, I can't teach anymore anyway, but that I can't teach Faulkner and Twain, that there's something awful in Huckleberry Finn being no longer readable for these kids. And then, of course, you have James, this lovely, recent novel by Percival Everett, which picks up the character of Jim, which, of course, Twain has a somewhat two-dimensional sense of, and poses the question or tackles the challenge of what would this book like if I was in Jim's head and not Huck's head, and it's brilliant and it's very illuminating. I think what it misses is the pathos of Huck, which is the great morals. The reason it's a great book, that he is an unlettered kid from the wrong side of the tracks. What is he supposed to make of race? He uses the N-word. That's all there is to it. That's what he's been taught. And he has this galvanizing experience over time, difficult, and wants to resist it, about not only Jim's humanity, but in some sense that he could never say the way I'm going to say it, Jim is the father that he never had. So, but those are ways, in which this type of evolution, or, the sense in which even the books that we love change. Parts of them we take a different view on. Parts of them all of a sudden shine in the dark and scream at us.
Yeah, but look, I mean, there's always been resistance and aversion to certain types of literature. It changes over time. And I think there's an explanation for that that you've written about. I mean, you talk about how, a life without literature is a life of a zombie, right? I don't think you use that term, but you said you live in a certain state of, I don't know, torpor or sleepiness or, sleepwalking through life. And, literature kind of awakens you, but then you say also that it comes at a price, right? There's a cost to it. And a lot of people don't want to pay that cost, right? Because it's not a pleasurable experience, right? Coming to know things about yourself and about the world.
Right. But it's hard, Socrates made the same claim. All I know is that I know nothing, and that's supposed to be not a way to stop, but a way to keep going at it. Yes, I mean, yes, it's painful to come to a more critical sense of who one is or what one has been. It's hard to say that that's almost any definition of the good life has to make room for that. You can't say, I want to continue being benighted, or I want to continue being deaf to, or blind to the humanity of others. It is what we do because we're locked into our own brains and bodies and hearts. Again, why books and art is so important, because it's one of the rare cultural tickets out of that, and at least in a kind of potential way, in a vicarious way, to inhabit for a while other subjectivities. All of that You can go to London, you can walk the streets. You can't reimagine Shakespeare. The only way to reimagine Shakespeare is, in fact, to read the plays. You can see, of course, they don't dress the way we do. The Globe Theater was different, but it's the plays themselves that enter into us, or that we enter into, and that's why, Bloom said, we know more about this man than we know about our best friends. I think he was right.
But look, I don't think there are any visions of the good life that include ignorance, right? So, there are lots of competing visions for the good life. I think even the ones who say, hey, you want to be happy and comfortable and so forth, they wouldn't say that you should be ignorant. So, is the vision of the good life that our current undergraduates get exposed to, it's clearly prioritizing a different type of knowledge, a different type of wisdom. What's the difference here? You say that, there's information and data right, on the one side, and then there's something else which literature offers.
That's right.
What's the difference? And why is it that you feel free to speculate. Why is it that we prioritize the information, as you call it, and deprioritize the alternative?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. One is that I think you can blame literature teachers on some of it, because they have taught novels as if they were just history. They haven't, because they think it is embarrassing, romantic in a very, nasty way, to ask students to empathize or identify with what they read. Whereas that's the ticket, I view. It doesn't mean that you're uncritical. It means that you inhabit, again, vicariously, momentarily, a different subjectivity, which is that both of the writer and of the character. So the culture itself has changed. Art is, we started by saying that the arts and literature are thought of as, in a sense, cultural frills. Do that on your own. Just read the books. And literature departments are shrinking. They're under attack throughout this country. It says a lot, not so much about literature, but it does in the sense of how it's taught. It's not taught, I think, in the much more sort of affect-oriented way that I'm talking about and that I have done all my life.
So in other words, when you study literature in college, you're taught to have a position of critical detachment, right?
That's right. And I think that that's a big mistake. Critical detachment is the absolute touchstone for all modern theory. Don't be taken in by the text, is the idea. Get your distance and pretty much explain what was ideologically wrong, what was blind in the writer. Didn't he see the things that now I see? There's a kind of remarkable arrogance in it that we now know enough to realize exactly what Shakespeare got wrong. Or, we read, any of these texts from earlier and say, well, it's a good thing we're not living then. And God knows what we're going to look like. The books that are written today, how they're going to be read next century, assuming people can still read then. I don't know if that's much of an answer to your question, but it seems to me that there are a lot of excellent factors that go into the kind of divide, as you put it, between the two ways of learning. Today's culture, and therefore today's university, privileges what people know of as the STEM fields. It's thought that they have a lock on what's important to know. And in some narrow sense, of course, that's true. If you want to get a job and pay off the debt you've got for going to university or whatever, then the knowledge of the STEM fields is absolutely crucial. But it does not claim to, and it cannot offer what you get in the arts. And yet the arts and literature are fighting for their lives. I remember when I first started teaching at Brown, we had a pioneer colleague who created computer studies at Brown. This was in 68, 69, 70. He was thought to be exotic. And I had huge enrollments in my courses, and now you could flip the scene. Any course in code or this, that, and the other can have a big audience, but a course in literature won't. And it's not because of the way they're taught, even though that's probably a factor. It's because of the people who come at 18 and 20 have already been formed, and they've already absorbed this view that this is a frill of sorts. So when you have time, you read a novel. If you can't go to sleep, you read this, and that poetry particularly, has nothing to do with real experience. And that's one reason I make the sort of meat and potatoes arguments that I do, that the issues that I'm talking about, there's nothing esoteric about them. That living, feeling, being hungry, being hurt, being in joy, these books give us some of that. The information strikes me as awfully dry and arid. And it's also, I think of the way with our culture of imaging and, that the greatest, machines possible, whatever MRI, anything like that, cannot see the heartache. They can see the heart. I think I've said that, the heart means one thing to the cardiologist and another to the liver. Or that it's a completely different, perspective and a different reach and a different result. And it's as if our culture has become so sort of materialistic on the one hand, which is what makes people think I've got to graduate in order to get a job, in order to make a lot of money. But also, I think that the professors bear some of the blame, that they've taught literature as just a sort of minor form of history. Yes, and at the same time, this is what was going on. And I don't think enough people have tried to see what is so front and center in these texts in terms of the immediacy that they provide, for readers. And this used to be the case, in earlier cultures. People read these books. They read them for wisdom. I don't think they said we're reading them, in order to school the heart, but I think that was understood. That's what was wise about these texts. They certainly were not reading them to memorize them so that they could quote them either in a podcast or in a dinner party.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people would say if you want to understand people, then, study psychology, study sociology, anthropology, economics, right? We have all these sciences of the human, right? What's missing there? I mean, you use this, I think you talked about, an extra dimension that you get with literature. I've heard that phrase used with religion as well, right? That, religious people have an extra dimension. And, you can see it, I think. I mean, if you've ever been religious, then if you lose your religion, you know what it's like to kind of, lose that extra dimension.
Right.
And I think the same is true with literature. I think I can sort of tell sometimes when I meet somebody, like, is this somebody who reads literature? Because they automatically have, I guess, this extra dimensionality. I don't know. I mean, maybe I don't know if that's true in your experience, but what exactly is that extra dimension that is missing?
When I meet people and I tell them who I am, and then I say I'm a literature professor at Brown, usually that stops the conversation. Because it's not like this is an exotic foreign language that I know nothing about, which is a great pity, as I said, because I think it's meat and potatoes. Think about the fact that Freud, for example, would only be taught in a literature course today, never in a psychology course. It's because psych departments the paradigm that they believe in or that makes them modern is to see psychology as exclusively a scientific procedure.
Well, the Bible also, you can get the Bible in literature classes now too.
That's right. I mean,
right.
It's a great melting pot. It's where all of the sort of, again, non-STEM areas, are to be found. But those areas, as I say, have changed. I can remember Brown faculty meetings where people in the science department, one of them I recall standing up and saying, what's wrong with you literature people is that in my field, I think it was biology, we know the difference between something that is right and something that is wrong, that is false, true and false. And reading a book, a novel, it doesn't work that way. It's not like they're empirically wrong. And most people are empirically wrong much of the time. That also is part of our equipment, is that we get things wrong and that we revise our lenses to the degree we can.
Well, I mean, I think you also use a lot of imagery related to the body. I mean, you talk about literature as sort of an umbilical cord. I mean, you use the analogy of cannibalism. I mean, this is kind of brutal in a way, but it's also very, very physical. I mean, I think most people, when they think of literature, they might think of it as a cerebral exercise.
No.
But I think you're arguing that it's very corporeal. It's very.
And think about what cannibalism is. that the whole rationale for cannibalism is that you would only consume the flesh of another warrior. And the reason that you did so was to get into yourself, into your body, exactly that spirit, that courage, whatever it was, that it wasn't like, eating a turd or something like that. And so therefore it is brutal, but it's not only brutal. I don't know if you've read Melville's Benito Cereno, but it is very much cannibalism, I think, is the sort of not enough spoken of motif of it. It's what happens to the captain. It's what the slaves have done. He never writes that, but that's what it means. They have ingested the body of their master. And you think about, maybe that's what happens in revolutions. That's when you kill tyrants. It's not merely to get even in some sense. It's also a way of ingesting that power again. There's a wonderful play by Jean Genet called The Balcony, where people go to this brothel, but the men go in there and they can choose 3 different uniforms: the chief of police, or the general, or the priest. And that is what they choose in order to perform sexually. And it's as if the uniform gives them a kind of power that they could not otherwise get. So I made the mistake of talking about assigning that play to a bunch of Brown alums who were all in the business world. And
didn't go over well.
That did not go over well. And I think many of them must have written the dean who offered me this invitation, that this guy should never be let loose again.
Well, I mean, you talk about how you encourage your students to, quote, try it on, right? So when you read a text, try it on. And that means try it on even though it doesn't feel like it fits well, even though it, is pinching, it's uncomfortable. I mean, do you think that people in general are too averse to discomfort, right? I mean, I've read a lot of books that are extremely uncomfortable. In fact, I kind of prefer to read the ones that are the most uncomfortable, and that kind of disrupt things and, make me start doubting all sorts of stuff. I mean, what is it about this type of discomfort that kind of scares people? I mean, you quote Kafka, right? This wonderful metaphor of literature as an axe that like cuts through your frozen soul. I mean,
Now,
do you think that, do you think that we are, I don't know, too averse to discomfort in that way?
Yes, I do. I think we're too averse to discomfort. We know it. We use the word pinch, that we know it when we experience direct pain. I think it could be said with some credibility that if you only read the books that make you feel good, you're reading the wrong books. That the only education, there's an old text we both know about that says to walk in another's shoes. You could say those shoes are too small for me. They pinch as well. But that's the price tag for imagining again the humanness, the alterity of others. Alterity says, no, that's othered. The project of reading, but also the project of love, project of friendship, all of that entails risking that kind of discomfort. Anyone who's ever had an argument with someone they love has experienced it as discomfort, but it happens to be absolutely basic reality. It's
well, I think and I think that's how you define a classic, right? I mean, a classic is not this thing up on a pedestal that you admire, but it's something which, disturbs you or, kind of knocks a bunch of your illusions onto the ground, right?
That's exactly right. And you mentioned that course, Order and Chaos in Literature, which was one of my first courses at Brown that I taught. And I started with the premise that to my students, you probably assume that literature is read in order to give us a kind of orderly sense of the world, to give us a sense in which we now see how things fit together. And I said the opposite is no less and perhaps even more true, which is we are supposed to exit a literature course not exactly being more confused, but more embattled in a sense, to see that other ways of being as well as other ways of other values that people might have is a kind of absolutely basic meat and potatoes element of human life. You can't just live in your own silo, in your own, scheme, even though you're locked in it. That's the point. We cannot exit ourselves, which is, of course, why it's, let's say, as opposed to tourism, where you get enough money to finally see the pyramids, you don't get inside that culture by seeing the pyramids. You would get inside that culture by reading something about, and not necessarily history at all, but some through history, but a lot through literature, about what was real about that looks at first exotic to you until it gradually becomes real.
If only we had some literature that survived from the times of the pyramid. So, I mean, I've read in the Chronicle a bunch of accounts by literature professors bemoaning the fact that they can't assign books to their students anymore. And I think we were talking earlier about how, I had a professor who was, assigning Clarissa, go read Clarissa and come back in a couple of days, Go read The Idiot and come back in a couple of days. And apparently that doesn't happen anymore, right? The stories are getting shorter and shorter. And I can't but imagine that if Pascal were around today, he would be fascinated by TikTok, right? I mean, this is divertissement on steroids. I mean, do you think that, in order for you to truly be affected and disturbed and awakened in this way, I mean, you need to have the capacity to sustain attention over an extended period of time?
Yeah, of course. I think you're absolutely onto that. That's correct. I think if students could be, in a sense, awakened before they start, if possible, that this has something in it for you. In one of my books, I think in the last one, I say that people, I think people do approach anything that they're involved with in that sense of nurture. Does this have something for me? Whether it smells good like a pie or anything else, what's in it for me? And literature answers those questions, in my opinion, because it gives you a taste, as it were, of what, it was like to be alive then or to make the decisions that one made then. Can't get it anywhere else. You can get it as historical data, but you can't get the experiential sense of it. That's why, again, Kierkegaard is so wonderful about that. He said that everybody who's educated knows the story of Abraham and Isaac. What they've missed is the fear and trembling. They do not realize what it meant to be Abraham, who did not know the outcome. All of our knowledge, it seems to me, is outcome-based. We can say 1492, we know what that means. What about before 1492? Or what it took to have that? And that's why Kierkegaard pulls out all the stops in Fear and Trembling, which is the text that I like the most, to make us experience all of the anxiety and the terror to be told by God to sacrifice your own child, particularly when you're an old man and you're not going to get a lot more children. And he realized that things learned only in terms of data, in terms of outcomes, are missing not only information, they're missing what makes these events great, what makes these stories great. It's what Abraham had to overcome. That is the mark of his faith, except it comes at a terrible human price tag, and it defies our logic. He has to have thought, I'm obeying God's command. God cannot possibly keep my son away from me dead. Therefore, if I kill him, this is the work of God, he will somehow be restored. And of course, logically, that doesn't hold. Maybe that's the nature of faith, etc. But the story, people have written, Woody Allen has talked about it too. Lots of writers have talked about that if you woke up tomorrow morning and said, I had a dream and God came to me and said, I must kill my child, they'd lock you up.
Right. Send you off to prison or the psychiatric home for you, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. But you also, I love this other metaphor you have about the shelves, right? You say that in every household, you've got the medicine shelf and the bookshelf. I don't know whether that's true anymore. I don't know whether everybody has a bookshelf. I thought you left out the spice shelf, which I also have in my house. But I love this metaphor. But the metaphor breaks down a little bit because I think, when it comes to medicines, there is a medicine for every ailment. And so you have an ailment, you go find the medicine. It seems like, with literature, it's not clear what ailment it is addressing until after you've consumed it. You know.
Yeah. Well, let me answer it doubly. First, my cynical reading that has only become possible because I'm so old and I'm living around people who are sick, and so that I'm not even sure medicines fix what they're supposed to fix. That's the scientific claim. But the other view of it is, which is really what I had in mind when I wrote that, which is that here's how they're alike. We think of them as completely different, right? They're alike in as much you absorb each one. And you absorb each one because it has a certain potency, at least it's said to cure whatever it is you have. And that we think of books, as I said, too much as kind of frills. They too get inside of you. Reading that's exactly what it does. It puts it inside of you. It then inhabits your own interior, and it acts. It lives. It's not the same as what an antibiotic does, but there's a very rigorous parallel, I think. I mean, no scientist would agree with me, but that's what I think.
Yeah, and I think you reference that image in Hamlet, right, of poison in the ear, and you say that that language can be like poison, right? I never made that connection. I don't know how many times I've seen Hamlet, and I never thought of the poison as being language.
Well, and it's particularly a lie. That's what a lie is. It's poison in the air, and it works. A lie works the way a poison does, in a way that even Shakespeare doesn't explore. That Hamlet's, father, Hamlet Sr., dies because he was given hemlock. Poison in the ear is, for example, what's happening in Othello. That's what Iago does. And it grows inside of him. It makes him essentially mad and murderous because Iago is brilliant at preying on all of Othello's insecurities and anxieties. He's, in a sense, a black man, a Moor, in a white Venetian Christian culture. Therefore, he's old, much older than we ordinarily think, because he's worried about that. There are lines that say it. And Iago gets all of that and works on this man and shapes him. So his lies, that she's cheating on you, etc., jealousy itself is almost an organic process. It's not a notion. It's something that grows and eats you alive. And Shakespeare is a brilliant sort of representative, not just student of that, but he knows how to show that. By the way, Act 3, Scene 3, in the very middle of the play is when you have this long sequence where Iago feeds the poison to Othello. And at the beginning of this scene, Othello is still convinced that his wife is fine, there's no problem. And at the end of the scene, where we have watched Iago brilliantly, shrewdly give him all of these lies, that seeding these things that will grow, sprout inside of him, at the end, he is mad. He's raving. He's convinced. But I'm struck by the organic nature of it, that the lies live. They grow. It's what rot is, isn't it? I mean, it just gets worse and worse.
Yeah, and I've always thought that, if somebody is experiencing jealousy and, they're much more likely to question it or understand it deeply from having read Shakespeare as opposed to having read some, cognitive psychology study on jealousy, right?
It's the green-eyed monster as well. I mean, it doesn't have a bottom. It doesn't have a floor. You can never get clear of it. Othello keeps saying he wants ocular proof that she is pure. We don't have ocular proof of anything, really, when it comes to other people. We can look at them. We don't have proof of what they have either done or thought or felt. But I think that, I think particularly our world of imaging is a little bit geared to that. We can find something that shows us what's going on. And of course, I guess in the world of, germs and illness, there's obviously a measure of truth in that, but not in the world of human relationships.
Well, there's another piece of Shakespeare that you reference often, which is that quote from Gloucester, of course, to see things feelingly. And it seems like, the world of science can only teach you a certain way of seeing things, right? And it's not the feeling way of seeing things.
That's right.
I mean, is literature required and necessary in order for one to know, how to feel, how best to feel?
Know facts feelingly. Lear is 5 solid acts of that type of education, and Gloucester's had the same thing. Both of them have made, decisions that were erratic, spontaneous, and blind, and they pay for it through 5 acts. It's absolutely, it's really, really dark, the tragic vision in those plays. One hopes that when students read those plays, they don't, it doesn't poison them, but it tells you something about the way in which, whether it's a lie, whether it's deception of some other sort, it lives in us and it turns us into something, very different. And I don't think there's anything exotic or literary about that notion. Again, early in our talk, I mentioned, the genocide and what it takes to have this type of violence. It has to do with the humanity of others being canceled out.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like, yes, we're made to feel discomfort, which is a question you put to me earlier, but it's meant to enlarge us, the discomfort, not just to be uncomfortable. And if we read the books that only tell us what we want to know, which is what we're headed towards in this society today with the current, political scene, any text that is critical of American history is considered woke and therefore removed. And I'm worried that we're going to get a generation of people who think that American history is a fairy tale, which it's not. And no amount of rhetoric can change that. And we can police and prohibit these certain kinds of texts. We can take over the Kennedy Center, but we cannot, in fact, change what all of that is about, which is that we're still paying the bill for the history of racism and slavery in this country. It's not solved. We can just try to put it under the rug, but it's not solved by any means. So it's in that sense that, the discomfort is required. If it simply massages us, say, oh, this is terrific, then I think we're reading the wrong book.
Well, I think you said somewhere in one of your books that the liberal arts are meant to teach you about life and not about your job, right? To prepare you for life and not to prepare you for a job. And so I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the relationship between, say, teaching and reading, or I guess, reading in a classroom setting as opposed to reading alone. I mean, you can obviously read literature in the comfort of your own home, but there's something about reading literature with other people, maybe, reading it and discussing it in the classroom that is different. Is there something about, I don't know, the university environment that prepares you to do this on your own? Or should we be thinking about, doing things over a lifetime that is comparable to what you get in the university classroom? And I certainly miss those classroom experiences where you could actually discuss texts. Me, mostly when I read literature now, I read it and then it's me and the text, and that's it. I don't have anybody to talk about it with, and I certainly don't have a teacher who can kind of guide me and help me to understand it better.
I both agree and don't with that. That having been on the other side of the equation with classroom experience, I became so aware of this sort of weird psychology that sets in a discussion section. My courses, I would lecture for 80 minutes, and then we would have 80 minutes of class. And I had a lot of TAs, so I would take the seniors. I was really spoiled, and take no more than 20 of them and put them in a room and let's all have at it. And I would then, at the end of the semester, usually it took me that long to catch on, they would write and explain but sometimes you could see it, that when the smartest person in the room is holding forth, others are furious. They're not just listening. In an ideal class, the ones that really do work, and they exist, I'm not disagreeing with you about that. When that happens, there's a kind of group sense in which there's an actual building going on, that there's a real sense of growth. I came in here thinking this text was about that, and not just the professor, but the person who lives across the hall has challenged that, and that is fascinating. So nothing can replace the classroom experience. I do, started by suggesting that it has its own psychological price tag, including having the professor there. that students are frequently don't feel free enough to say what they really think about a book, because this guy who's going to give them a grade is the one who assigned it. And in some way, I think you know this from this last book of mine, strangely enough, teaching with Coursera was in 2013 and 14, where I had thousands of students taking this course. Those students, even though they were located in different places, there were so many different threads and communications between them, and they built on them. And I thought at times it almost embarrassed what happens in the classroom. That it, obviously I was warned when I did this that you're going to get bullies on Coursera and this, that, and the other. I was lucky I never got that. And other courses taught in Coursera were courses that were essentially fact-driven, information-driven. I'm going to teach you how to do coding. I'm going to teach you about what followed what, in the French Revolution. Not literature. It's about digging in and about people talking about how it related to the course I taught, and the course was called The Fiction of Relationship. So they were invited firsthand to talk about, how this perhaps bore on their own lives or what they've seen. But they said it on screen, within the machinery that we had, and others would respond, and then they would be responded back to. And I was shocked. It made me realize that, as I said, that I was sometimes in the way, that the professor is, but also that this is could be an extraordinarily civilized form of interpretation. Interpretation, not just because isn't that interesting, but that it changes. We came in thinking this, and we're going to exit thinking that.
I mean, do you ever follow up with your students from 20, 30, 40 years ago? Did you ever find out the extent to which they have continued to read literature? Or is it that the text that they got exposed to kind of shaped who they were, and then that was it? Right? Or did you actually, teach them how to live a life that involved the continuous consumption of literature?
I'm not sure. I don't know that there would ever be any proof of that. They don't report on that. What they report is often exaggerated, but this course changed my life. At first, that feels wonderful, and then second, you think, they actually may believe it, at least when they write it to me, or they may want me to believe it, but I sort of wonder. I have had a few courses when I was in college that changed my life, but not very many. 1, 2, and only a couple in graduate school, but the ones that did. So it's not clear to me.
Well, not according to those journals. So according to those journals you talked about in one of your classes, did they
right.
never mention you? Never mention any of their professors?
That's right. That was fascinating. And that was an welcome.
Kind of sad, though, right?
Information. But I also, it's funny because you'll get an email. I've gotten them, someone who first says, you changed my life. And then they'll say, I'll never forget when you said, and then fill in the blank. And I'll read it and I say, I couldn't possibly have said anything that stupid. I didn't say that. And then I think, so what? That it had that impact on them, which is a way of honoring really the whole teaching profession, that I'm listening and I'm going to put it to use, that this matters. And I think I call it in that book a kind of chain, a chain of being, that it connects teachers and students over time. So I've had a lot of, wonderful communications from former students. Mind you, I only hear from the ones who like me. I only hear from the ones who were persuaded that this is meaningful. You never hear from what in the book I call the unwashed crowd. That they, and I think that our courses at university, and not just in literature, are absolutely filled with people who don't get very much for it. They know enough, they're smart enough to write the right answers for either the exam or the final essay, but I don't think they take it with them. It doesn't stay inside of them. So I feel like education, if we're lucky, we get to a certain number of them. And if we're lucky, people, when I taught with Coursera, or when I taught with the teaching company, that was one of the great pleasures of it, is that older people would say, I read this book when I was in college or when I was in high school, and only now do I understand, what its meaning is. And I think that's an enormous bunch of people. whether they're poorly taught, whether they're too young to get it. As I say, Lear makes much more sense to older people than younger people. But I think we have illusions about how much people learn. Now, it's one thing to learn coding. It's one thing to learn chemistry. That has nothing to do with how mature you are or what life experiences you've had. That is not true for literature. And so you could argue that we start them too early. That they haven't had enough life experience to know what exactly is an issue or at stake in these texts. That's not something they're happy to hear. But that teaching ideally goes on and on and on. And I was thinking about your comment too, and it made me think of book clubs are a way today and library groups to actually keep some of this alive. And I think they're always based in an unspoken way. I think it's unspoken, that I want to return to this, that I either didn't get it or was too rushed doing other things, too hurried. This wasn't important then. And now, and this is particularly true for retired people, now I'm finally free at last to take another look. But then maybe I need some help, somebody to sort of show me why this book actually is as meaningful as he or she thinks it is.
Yeah, I joined a book club last year, and it was made up of professors, and we're doing close readings of philosophical texts. But it's interesting to note that everybody in that group is tenured. It's like, they're like, oh man, now I can actually go back and do what I came into this business for in the first place, right? I mean, do you think that in the current academic context, it's possible to integrate your scholarship and your teaching? I mean, do we need to make the scholarship? Do we need to change the nature of the scholarship so that it aligns with the kind of teaching that we ought to be doing, or can academics just live these two separate lives where they are, doing what needs to be done to get published, and then they can do this other stuff in the classroom?
That's the indictment, I think, of our field, which is that they publish stuff that only makes sense to other experts. And it's as if writing for ordinary people has just, because I think books are for ordinary people. Even Hamlet is for ordinary people. The Great Gatsby is for ordinary people. But if you read any article written by a professor that gets into print today, at least in a literary journal, most people can't read it. It's filled with what I take to be jargon, what I call theory speak. It's what is hot at that moment, and the young people certainly have to do it because it's the only way they're going to get promoted. But there is this real chasm between the issues and, above all, the language of professional criticism on the one hand, and human experience, particularly for people who are not graduate students or professors, on the other hand. And I think that there are many wonderful critics, who are not trapped in that. I mentioned Harold Bloom, but there are lots of. I think the greatest critics make sense for the general readership, but you wouldn't know it in most of the professional journals. They are instead for the initiated who already know this discourse and can follow it. So what I'm saying is in the right world, there should be no real distinction between teaching and scholarship. Obviously, you can't do it. And some scholarship has been very meaningful to me, some less so. I think that, but I don't think that my confrère, the other people, the people in the profession, I think think about the way it works. So many professors say, now I'm really interested in the smartest ones here. They're going to write papers that I can write long commentary on because it really gets at issues that I have strong views on. They've understood this, now I'm going to help them understand that. What about the ones who write lousy papers? How do you get through to them? The book could get through. It's you that's not getting through. And it's the way perhaps that you've presented it. And yet I'm sure that I have had colleagues at Brown who think, well, Weinstein has big enrollments because he obviously simplifies, or he clearly, doesn't do a responsible job of conveying the scholarly opinion. I try to do it in this talk. I've tried to get some of it where I think it's germane. And as you know, from, in my career, I was lucky. I was lucky that my temperament was such, and I guess my brain and heart were such that I could do both. That I've written 9 books, and I've gone to conferences and given papers. And at the same time, I had the great luck, because it is luck, to teach at a place like Brown and have these smart young people coming your way. As I've said, every year they're the same age. It doesn't occur to you that the one that's changing is you. But so I was, this, of course, is a way of limiting whatever I have to contribute, because I was lucky. And I found no incompatibility between those things. But I do think they spoke, I was rhetorical in my classes in a way that I'm not in my books. You can hear from the way I'm talking, it's pretty much street language, not entirely, but I have some, Latinate terms that I use, but I don't think that there's nothing specialized about literature, at least about literature that's important.
So, I mean, if we're to look at the kind of marginalization of literature in academia and the broader culture, I mean, is it a supply issue or is it a demand issue? I mean, if you were to offer classes on literature like the ones that you offer at most universities, I mean, do you think that people would enroll? I mean, is it that the academics have science envy and they don't really want to do this stuff, or is it that the students, they all want to learn to code and take economics classes?
I'm going to give you a kind of sort of embarrassing answer. When I would teach, for example, literature and medicine, I would have at least 2/3 of the students would be pre-meds. But they went out of their way to tell me it's the only literature course at Brown they ever took. So how do you get on their agenda? In this case, it was clear. I called it literature and medicine. And of course, I've taught so many years that I had some reputation, and they clearly, hear about this is a course to take. This is one they really get close to. So I don't know how to solve that problem. I think that it's a combination. The easy answer would be to say that our culture, American culture, modern culture, prioritizes the STEM fields. And therefore, the humanities have to fight for their lives. The harder thing to say is that it's partly the fault of the humanists. That their fields, and this is true for religious studies as well as it is for teaching art history or film. Look at film criticism; it's impenetrable. And the same, I think, by the way, the course that I mentioned to you were texts and teachers, or we had people from philosophy and literature and religious studies. We would devote after every 3 weeks, we would get together and fight it out in front of the students. All of us would be on stage, and there were students who wrote in saying, what I didn't like about this course is I came out as confused as I was going in. Right. And I thought to myself, I wanted to say to them and shake them and say, that's because one take is different from the other. And we fought it out on those days. I remember my colleague in French studies, who was a Pascal scholar, when he heard the Kierkegaard lecture, he couldn't stop himself. He said, he was French. He said, you have lost everything that is important in Kierkegaard. Because but Pascal speaks to the human soul, and there is enormous, sort of pathos in that. Whereas the lecture I thought it was a wonderful lecture, but it was much drier, much more sort of, a way of sort of analysis. And it did not press the same buttons that my scholar, who was a very great scholar, by the way. I mean, he moved from Brown to Yale. But his lectures were wonderful because he never lost sight of what was flesh and blood as well in his materials. But the students didn't like the fact that we argued with each other. It embarrassed them.
In an earlier podcast, we were discussing this quote by somebody who said that, a philosopher is someone with whom you speak, and you wind up more confused at the end than at the beginning.
And I think it's true for every field.
Right. Well, I think that's true in literature as well. I mean, you use this image from St. Paul, right? Through a glass darkly, and the idea is that you're seeking clarity, but it seems like for every clarity that you achieve through literature, new opacities are presented to you, right? And
That's true. I agree with
and
that.
so
The mix of light and dark. But I think that often enough students come in thinking it's all going to be light, and that's the reason they're taking the course. That's the reason they're paying tuition. And so that's a myth. Anything worth studying, whether it's the Bible or whether it's Shakespeare or Freud, for that matter, is it points to darkness. If it's not, it's readable, but it points to darkness. And we have darkness in our world, for Christ's sake. Take a look at the violence in this society. Take a look at our political situation. There's no nice way to describe any of that. I think if you educated people more in darkness than understanding what it's like or why we have it, what has failed in our society, I'm worried that we're trying to expunge that from all teaching and writing and make it look like a fairy tale, America's greatest country on earth, and all there is to it. And that just drives me nuts.
Well, for most of my life, I tried to split my reading 50-50 between, on the one hand, essays, fiction, and memoirs, and on the other hand, nonfiction, social science, and so forth. Since I started this podcast, I've kind of gone 90-10. So I've squeezed my consumption. I need to maybe cut back on the podcasts if I'm going to, be more balanced. But I guess last question I would have for you, right? I mean, how do you decide how to allocate your reading? I mean, it sounds like you consume mostly classics, but I always tried to read a lot of contemporary fiction as well. I mean, it's a little bit riskier because you don't know. It hasn't stood the test of time. You don't have a whole lot of critics who are telling you how worthwhile it is. I mean, how do you decide what to read?
Well, now I'm so old that it's hard for me to read a lot of new things. And it's also the case that if you are teaching classics, you've got to reread them and you've got to refresh them and maybe see what the new scholarship looks like. It was always a sort of rule of thumb for me that I would put some new text into most of my courses. It was very selective. I can remember adding Toni Morrison to one of my books in one of my courses because I loved her work. I mentioned to you, I think, off camera that I put, or maybe it was on camera, I can't remember, put Naked Lunch into a course where I remember when we discussed that, a student in the discussion group walked out of the room and hissed at me, I didn't come to Brown University to hear stuff like this or to read books like this. But so one wants ideally to create a kind of diverse curriculum within the same course, to have text and that's one of the great virtues of being in comparative literature, that things that are classics in some tradition have never made it into the American audience, even though they've been translated. They were not the kind of English-American canon that students were used to. You've read more widely, I know that, but the students who come to us don't know much. I mean, it's one of the fun things about teaching the Scandinavian course. They never heard of most of these books. Whereas Ibsen and Strindberg and Chekhov, none of them wrote in English. They are the bedrock on which modern theater exists. O'Neill and others became possible because of these three 19th century writers who wrote about modern life for the first time. They rejected, in a sense, Shakespeare, because modern life is not where we speak in poetic language. It's prose. Prose is the term that Shakespeare wouldn't have used, even though his work has many different registers.
And I guess another question I'd have for you is, we talk primarily about literature, but you reference essay. I mean, Montaigne. Montaigne is literature, right? I mean, Pascal and Kierkegaard are literature, right? I mean, Arthur Miller is literature, memoirs. I mean, how do you allocate your time across all those different genres? And, at what point, where do you draw the line between literature and these other domains?
Well, the answer is that you draw the line in as much as your main focus has got to be on your field. But I think I quoted in the book, when my career changed because there was a very charismatic guy at Brown that I got to know in my second or third year. He created a field called human studies.
Oh, right. Yeah.
He had a position in applied math, which is not like the math department. It's by far the elite math department. He left it. This is like the man without a country. He left his department and created this group which had 5 or 6 professors I was asked to join. And it changed my life. It changed my writing. It changed my teaching. One of his comments that I love to quote is that you cannot understand your discipline until you leave it. What he meant is you can't see its blind spots. You can't see what it cannot access. That history helps you see literature. Literature helps you see history. That philosophy, et cetera, needs a good dosage of literature, which is why we created that course and let the disciplines, not the people, the disciplines themselves do battle with each other. And there's no obvious answer here. There's no winner or loser. But the students were confused. They wanted to get, what's the right take on this? Well, has anybody ever offered the right take on reality? Universities come packaged in disciplines. Life doesn't. It doesn't. All of our major problems cannot be solved with any single discipline, including economics and coding.
Well, I mean, I think you're describing the reason why I decided to spend my whole life in the university. It hasn't always been that way, but being able to wander around just a few buildings away and get exposed to this stuff. Although I think it's probably more true in the English universities. When you go to sit at high table, at Oxford, you have these people from all these different disciplines eating with you. In American universities, it's a bit harder. So I'm kudos to you for participating in a program like that.
Thank you very much.
Well, Arnold, thank you so much for joining me. This has been fantastic. I'm sure we could talk forever, but everyone should go and check out. I don't know where you should start. Maybe, start off with the great courses and listen to, I think only one of those courses is available on the app now. You got to make sure they go and resurrect the other ones and make them available to everybody. And then also check out this one, The Lives of Literature.
Thank you so much. This was fun, Greg. I really enjoyed it. Take care.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.